Imagine a closed physical system, a frozen box, 200 feet long and 85 feet wide, enclosed by reinforced boards and unbreakable glass. Now, fill that confined space with exceptionally large, incredibly fast, and deeply aggressive men, moving on steel blades. If you look at the National Hockey League in the late 1970s and early 1980s through the lens of pure physics, it was a meat grinder. The underlying formula for success was fundamentally linear. Dump the puck into the opponent's zone, chase it down, physically batter the defender into submission, and force the puck into the net through sheer, overwhelming force. To survive in this system, let alone dominate it, the baseline requirement was physical mass. You needed muscle. You needed armor. Then, a new variable entered the equation. A kid from Ontario who entirely broke the physical mold. He stood roughly 6 feet tall, but weighed a soaking wet 170 pounds. When he participated in standard team physiological testing, his results were notoriously abysmal. He routinely finished dead last in baseline strength tests. He couldn't bench press an impressive amount. He possessed a distinctly average slap shot. In a league defined by explosive, straight-line speed, his skating was fundamentally unremarkable. His name was Wayne Gretzky. According to every established metric of the era, Gretzky was physically unequipped to survive the violent architecture of the NHL. He should have been a marginal player, a novelty act, easily neutralized by the towering defensemen of the time. But on December 30th, 1981, the established mathematics of the sport simply stopped making sense. On that night, in his 39th game of the season, playing against the notoriously physical Philadelphia Flyers, Gretzky scored 5 goals. In doing so, he achieved something that hockey experts considered mathematically impossible. He scored his 50th goal in just 39 games. Prior to this, the absolute benchmark for hockey greatness was scoring 50 goals in 50 games, a feat accomplished by only 2 men in history. Gretzky shattered that ceiling, hitting 50 in 39. This was the moment the glitch in the matrix became impossible to ignore. How does a physically inferior player not just survive a league built on brute force, but completely short-circuit its scoring parameters? It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was because Gretzky wasn't playing the same game as everyone else. While the rest of the league was playing a linear game of physical checkers, Gretzky had mapped the ice like a geometric chessboard. He realized early on that since he could not outmuscle the league, he had to outprocess it. He didn't just adapt to the NHL, he fundamentally hacked its spatial parameters, and his team was about to figure out exactly how to weaponize that advantage. To understand how you break a professional sports league, you have to understand the concept of processing speed. Gretzky possessed an unparalleled cognitive mapping ability. He inherently understood where the puck was going to be, rather than where it currently was. But a highly advanced processor still requires bandwidth to operate. In hockey, bandwidth is physical space. When both teams have 5 skaters on the ice, the defensive strategy is simple: clog the middle. Giant defensemen take away passing lanes by merely existing, using their bodies and long sticks to fill the spatial voids. When the ice is crowded, processing speed is neutralized by physical traffic. Gretzky initially solved this by establishing what became known as the office, the area directly behind the opponent's net. It was the one piece of real estate on the rink where a defender couldn't hit him without risking a penalty, and from there, Gretzky had a 360-degree view of the offensive zone. It was a brilliant tactical innovation, but the Edmonton Oilers, Gretzky's team, were about to discover an even more devastating exploit. They realized that if space was the only variable limiting their star player, they just needed to artificially create more space, and they found the mechanism to do it buried right inside the NHL rulebook. In the early 1980s, the rules dictated that if 2 players committed infractions against each other simultaneously, coincidental minor penalties, both players would go to the penalty box, and their respective teams would play with 4 skaters instead of 5. 4-on-4 hockey. The Oilers systematically weaponized this rule. They employed tough, aggressive players whose implicit tactical role was to agitate the opposition. Edmonton players would purposefully instigate scuffles and altercations with the opposing team's best defenders, baiting them into taking retaliatory penalties. The referees would blow the whistle, send both men to the penalty box, and suddenly, the ice would open up. This was the secondary catalyst that escalated Gretzky from a superstar to a league-breaking anomaly. The ultimate validation of this strategy arrived on May 19, 1984. On this date, the Edmonton Oilers dismantled the New York Islanders, a team that had won 4 consecutive championships, to claim their first Stanley Cup. The Islanders were a dynasty built on structured, physical, dominant hockey, but they had no answer for the Oilers' meta strategy. When the game shifted to 4-on-4, removing 2 large human bodies from the 200 by 85-foot playing surface, the traffic disappeared. The defensive structures evaporated. Given that extra fraction of a second and that extra few feet of open ice, Gretzky's geometric processing power became a completely unguardable algorithm. He could map passing lanes that defensemen couldn't even see. He would thread the puck through skates and sticks with terrifying precision. The Oilers were actively orchestrating a situation where the opposition was forced into a wider arena. And in a wider arena, the fastest mind always kills the biggest body. The league was hemorrhaging goals. The traditional powers of the sport were being rendered obsolete, not by superior athleticism, but by superior systemic manipulation. By the summer of 1985, the National Hockey League was facing an existential competitive crisis. The traditional coaching strategies, hit him harder, skate faster, trap the neutral zone, were completely ineffective against the Oilers' 4-on-4 exploit. You cannot coach a physical defense against a mathematical certainty. When a system is fundamentally broken by a user who has figured out an unbeatable exploit, the administrators of that system only have one option left. They have to patch the game. This leads us to June 1985. Arguably the highest compliment ever paid to a professional athlete. The NHL Board of Governors, the owners, executives, and rule makers of the sport convened for their annual meetings. They weren't looking at draft picks or marketing strategies. They were looking at how to stop Wayne Gretzky. They recognized that if they did not patch this spatial exploit, the Oilers would permanently break the competitive balance of the sport. During these meetings, the league officially implemented a monumental change to the rulebook, adding a provision that would universally become known as the Gretzky Rule. The board mandated a change to Rule 22C. They declared that moving forward, when teams took coincidental minor penalties, neither team would lose a skater on the ice. The players would still go to the penalty box to serve their time, but substitute players would be allowed to replace them. The game would remain 5-on-5. Think about the sheer gravity of this decision. The governing body of a century-old sport sat in a boardroom and consciously decided to rewrite their own rulebook, to artificially shrink the playable space, entirely to neutralize the cognitive processing power of one single player. They couldn't stop him on the ice, so they legislated against him from a conference room. They took away the open autobahn and forced him back into heavy traffic. This is the ultimate, grounded proof of absolute dominance. We often measure athletes by the trophies they hold or the records they break. But trophies are just metal, and records are just numbers waiting to be surpassed. True, terrifying dominance is when the governing architects of your reality are forced to step in and alter the physical parameters of the environment, because you have solved their game too perfectly. The implementation of the Gretzky Rule in the summer of 1985 was supposed to be the great equalizer. The league had successfully patched the exploit. The 4-on-4 cheat code was dead. The extra space was gone. The giants of the league were back to clogging the middle, 5-on-5, ready to physically smother the kid from Ontario. So, what happens when you take away a genius's favorite tool? You find out exactly how deep the genius runs. In the immediate aftermath of the rule change, during the 1985 to 1986 season, Wayne Gretzky returned to the newly restricted 5-on-5 ice surface. Stripped of the artificial space his team used to generate, he simply processed the restricted space faster. That season, he didn't just win the scoring title, he scored 215 points. It remains, to this day, the highest single-season point total in the history of the National Hockey League, a record that will likely never be touched. The NHL realized a cold, hard truth that year. They could change the rules. They could alter the geometry of the rink. They could put as many bodies in front of him as the law allowed. But you cannot legislate against processing speed. The patch failed because Wayne Gretzky wasn't just exploiting the system. He was the system.